Okay, good morning everyone in Europe, good afternoon in Asia and the Pacific. And if you are already connecting from the Americas, good night. So probably you should be sleeping. So welcome back to the second day of the Global Foresight Summit. This year, remember that we are organizing the summit with the APF, the Association of Professional Futurists, and the World Future Review, Journal of Strategic Foresight. And to start the second day, we have Peter Black from Queensland in Australia. Peter Black is a foresight practitioner and a veterinary epidemiologist, and he's working as a private consultant from Queensland in Australia. His expertise is in not only in foresight and futures, but also in health, which is very much related to the situation we have today in the world. Also, his expertise is not just only in health, it's in health with animals and how they are creating these transboundary diseases in between the human species and other animal species. So, Peter, welcome to the summit. We are going to be hearing you today on planetary health and the futures in the Anthropocene.
Thank you.
So I leave you here alone, and I will be here if you need me. So welcome, and I leave you here.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's actually good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. Can you see the screen now? Okay. Am I right to go ahead? I hope so. I can't see if people can see that screen or not, to be honest. It's a privilege to be here to speak to you today. I just want to let you know at the start that I am actually speaking from Gubbi Gubbi country here in Australia, and accordingly I wish to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging here on this land. So the title of the presentation is Planetary Health Futures in the Anthropocene, and I'll start with just a couple of sorts of definitions so that we're on the same page. Obviously, no, we won't. So the first definition is around planetary health, and the concept of planetary health is actually based on this understanding that human health and human civilization depend on the flourishing of natural systems and wise stewardship of those natural systems. So that's what planetary health, when I'm talking about planetary health, that's what I'm talking about. And this comes from a definition from the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission written in 2015. The Anthropocene is a term many of you are very familiar with. It's increasingly used to define a new epoch, and it's one in which humans have become the dominant force shaping Earth's geophysical composition and processes. And although it originated in the earth sciences, it's actually been widely adopted across academia and the public sphere as a bit of a catch-all description for the overwhelming impact of human activity on the planet. And the methodology that I want to use to look at these planetary health futures is a sort of modified causal analysis. And I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this from this method developed by Suhail Inayatullah, But for those of you who are not, I will just briefly go through the layers so that you have an appreciation. The litany is this top layer, and it's the sort of thing which would be read as a sort of headline in a newspaper, commonly available in media. So it's the official public description of an issue. And I'm going to go through the litany reasonably quickly and get to the systemic causes, which is the relationship between those issues within the litany. In this case, normally you'd talk about the systemic causes as what's underlying the specific litany issues, but I'm going to use it in this context to talk about some reports which bring them together to develop an understanding of the sorts of web of causation and relationship between the issues I'm talking about in the litany. And then underneath this is the worldview, and this is the discourse analysis. The worldview is what underpins the systemic causes, why we actually bring the systemic causes together in the way that we do. And there's I'll run through a range of a couple of worldviews at least today in this presentation with reference to planetary health. And then finally, the bottom layer is metaphors and myths. This is much more heart than head. It's the sorts of things you might see in an advertising slogan, or it's the sort of thing which resonates with different people, different demographics, different cultures, depending on their background, but it really resonates at a heartfelt level rather than it's not necessarily supposed to be purely rational. So at the litany level, as has already been mentioned, obviously the one which is on everybody's newspapers and in the media and taking up a lot of our attention at the time is to do with COVID-19, the coronavirus, which is causing this pandemic. It'd be very difficult to go a day without hearing some report about COVID in some way. We know there are numerous cases happening across the planet in different countries, and different countries have been affected in different ways. But apart from the fact that there are human cases, obviously there have been many millions of deaths, more than 3 million deaths globally. And there's been a lot of attention around this pandemic because it's upset global functions in so many different ways. And different parts of the planet are suffering in different dimensions in terms of how severe it is, what they're doing around vaccination, how available vaccination is, what are the strategies, etc., related to COVID-19. And I'm sure most of you will be very familiar with what's in the paper around reports to do with COVID-19. But more generally in the litany, there are also issues which relate to other dimensions, such as population growth. And again, you would read before anything to do with COVID, there will be reports about what's happening with population growth globally, and the expectation is that there'll be 11.2 billion, or approximately that many people on the planet by 2100. Even though the growth rate of the world population has decreased and is decreasing, it's starting from quite a high base now. And so these projections can be taken in terms of this conference, which is talking about beyond uncertainty. These projections, there's a fair level of certainty around demographic projections generally. Where is the growth happening? If you look at 1800, the year 1800 here, many of the people on the planet lived in China and India. And in the year 2100, it's still projected that a big proportion of the population will reside in China and India. But you will also notice that by 2100, the growth in the population in Africa will be quite immense. And if you look at some specific countries more closely, by about 2027, India will in fact have more people than China. And at the bottom there, you can see that later, towards 2050, the increase in the population of Nigeria especially is starting to ramp up quite rapidly. And Nigeria is projected to have a very large population after the middle of this century. Other issues, climate change is obviously a big issue that you cover and see very regularly in the paper. This is around energy demand, just highlighting the fact that about in China and India, between 2010 and 2035, about 50% of the growth will be in those two countries. Energy is not the issue alone. There's also changes in land use and agricultural practices, a whole range of other issues which drive global carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And this is just showing the projections in terms of the effect of the emissions on temperature change globally, with a number of the models which have been used to project temperature change over time. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these sorts of projections about what potentially will happen on the planet to do with climate change. This year, the head of the International Energy Agency has actually pointed out that carbon emissions are set to jump by about 1.5 billion tonnes this year. And it's, in his words, this is a dire warning that the economic recovery from the COVID crisis is anything but sustainable for our climate. And I suspect many of you are very familiar with that, but these changes in perceptions about what's going to happen with climate change are happening very rapidly. Other issues are to do with things like land use change that I've already mentioned. This is change in forest cover from 1990 to 2015, and more particularly around what some of the drivers are for those in different parts of the world. And they include things such as shifting agriculture, changes in forestry in some parts of the world, and more recently, wildfire. And although this was put together in 2018, even then they were suffering wildfires as a result of loss of forestry was due to wildfires. And in recent years, there have been even more severe wildfires in many parts of the planet, including Australia, which have had severe and profound effects on biodiversity and the natural ecosystem. Fertiliser use has also been growing as the population expands, and the projection is that it will continue. These human-produced reactive nitrogen will increase well into 2050 and beyond. This is not a new development, but it is continuing apace. And water use is another one which is critically important, and there's a projection out to about 2100. Finally, in this one, this is just about the increasing acidity of oceans globally and how that's affecting many different species and survival of ecosystems across the planet. And finally, just the one around biodiversity, showing that with business as usual by 2100, there will be a rapid loss of biodiversity. And even with increased conservation efforts, there'll be partial improvements in biodiversity, but we will really have to do something much more serious to regain biodiversity by 2100, and that would revolve around more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption efforts. The loss in biodiversity is in fact huge and rapid. There are things happening all over the planet in terms of not just animals and plants, but systems that are suffering as a result of the damage during the Anthropocene, which is due to human activity. So they're all litany, and in terms of the slides coming up, these are systemic causes which are trying to tie together these issues which previously, as I've mentioned, are almost siloed. You might see them as individual issues, but in fact they are related. And this report from The Economist in 2014 was actually a special edition around planetary health. And you can see there the issues covered included climate change, of oceans, livestock diseases, etc. The one on the right, that logo is actually the logo of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 2005. And it was a report which actually did not gain as much attention as it probably should have, as it covers many of the issues which clearly are feeding into the Anthropocene, but also affecting directly planetary health in terms of the systems which underpin the health of natural systems on the planet. Just going back to COVID in terms of the social or systemic causes, I mentioned that land use change, agriculture, and changes, those sorts of changes feed into the likelihood of emerging infectious diseases. And once a spillover event occurs, such as has happened with COVID, and we know very likely the source is bats, what the intermediate host might be is still being debated. But once it starts to transmit between humans, of course, the global spread is due to the fact that we have transport systems which can move people around the planet very quickly, and this feeds straight into the potential to have a pandemic where you have the disease spread across the planet as we do and we are experiencing right now with COVID-19. Another way to context or a framework lens to look at COVID-19, and this is from the World Economic Forum, the Strategic Intelligence, looking at a whole range of issues related to COVID-19, not just the virus and the disease, but also the impacts of COVID-19, also the sorts of things that feed into COVID-19 within this systemic causes layer of causal layered analysis. So these are different perspectives, still drawing together different parts of the system. This is directly from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and it's pointing out that the ecosystem services which are important, like the provisioning ones around food, water, and fuel, the regulating ecosystem services around climate, flood, disease, etc. These are all underpinnings for the life on Earth in terms of biodiversity, and they do feed directly into health, our constituents of well-being, and that is very much consistent with the view around planetary health. We need to have a very healthy set of ecosystem services to have great planetary health options. And in the Anthropocene, we know we are suffering the effects that have been impacted in so many ways across these ecosystem services. And this is like a dashboard that was reported in 2005 in that report, which shows that across different sorts of land types on the planet, the impact of things like habitat change or climate change. And with climate change, for example, you can see that in all cases across all types, there was a very rapid increase in the impact of climate change on those areas across the globe. And in fact, that was the same also for pollution in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. These reports haven't been renewed in a sense in the same way, but there are other perspectives which capture exactly the same messages. For example, this planetary boundaries diagram from Rockstrom, which was first published, I think, in about 2009. Although the green circle shows what the planetary boundary is, and if we stay within that boundary, we are surviving and thriving and living within the means of the planet to absorb and cope with the pressures we put on it. But once we get outside that green boundary, we are exceeding what's good for survival for us and the planet. And so you can see that climate change at the top has clearly exceeded already when it was first drawn the safe boundary, but the ones which have probably received less attention are biodiversity loss, which has far exceeded the capacity or the safe living capacity for the planet, and the nitrogen cycle. And these are all underpinnings which affect the possible futures for planetary health. More recently, there's been a report put out by the United Nations Environmental Program Unit called Peace with Nature. And I won't go through the slide at the left in detail at all, except to point out that it highlights the fact that we need to transform humankind's relationship with nature as a key to the sustainable future. In the same way as the planetary boundaries, it's pointing out that Earth's capacities to actually support life and provide resources and absorb waste matter have been so degraded and surpassed as per that planetary boundaries diagram that we need to be working towards restoring and adapting the capacity of the planet to support life. So it's telling exactly the same message from a different point of view or a different report. So the quote on the right is that says that while the response to the medical emergency of COVID-19 has rightly preoccupied government budgets and political action, the response to the pandemic must ultimately accelerate the economic and social transformations needed to address the planetary emergency. And the UN Secretary General pointed out that the COVID recovery and our planet's repair must be two sides of the same coin. And this is simply reiterating the concept around planetary health, that yes, COVID is almost a symptom of what's happening in terms of the pressure on the planet. And we need not just to worry about COVID, but we need to be repairing what's happening to the rest of the planet at the same time to ensure that we don't have repeated pandemics, which at the moment you'd have to say is looking pretty likely. The worldview, though, that underpins why we are in the sorry state that we are, I would argue, is very clearly dominated by the fact that economics is the dominant force in terms of the way the world functions. And you can see that even from when we're responding to the COVID pandemic. Yes, there's a health response, but there's also a lot of economic stimulus to make sure that the economy continues to limp along, and if not just limp along, grow, because it's thought that economic growth is the way to get us out of these difficult periods, when in fact this reliance or preponderance of faith in the current way economics has been framed has in fact underpinned why we've ended up with the problems we've currently got. So there are other worldviews where it's not economics rules. It was Bill Clinton who said, you know, it's the economy, stupid. Well, that thinking now is certainly coming under a lot of pressure, because the economy stupid has led to some pretty bad outcomes in terms of the way it's been delivered across the planet. There are other ways to actually frame responses, and a Prouter sort of perspective pays much more attention to things like cooperatives, and would frame the response in a very different way than a pure economic response. There's also things like steady state economics, which would argue that there is should be a biophysical equilibrium, and growth is not what's required, at least not economic growth, but moral growth is what's required. And there's a lot of attention starting to be paid around some of that, but not as much as you might expect. This one could easily have been put up as probably in the litany, but the thinking around the fact that infinite economic growth is actually not possible on a finite planet is now becoming a worldview which you know, if we're changing from this dominant economic growth model to this, it recognizes that there has to be another way. It's just simply not sustainable. And in the same way, this raises questions around intergenerational justice, because what we are doing to the planet is leaving it in a worse state for our forebears, our children, grandchildren, and future generations. And there's a lot of attention being paid to the fact that we need to be doing something to address this. It's not just a conceptual issue, it's biting clearly already. At the broadest level, if I talked about the economic rules at the start, what in my framework is like we're trying to move from what's regarded as a pig face, where ecology and society is actually just a bump attached to the economy, to something where the economy exists, but it's clearly within the bounds of ecological limits, social wants. And so the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment and not the other way around, as Gaylord Nelson, the governor of Wisconsin, said some time ago. And this move, I'm supposing that I'm hopeful that this change in worldview will in fact improve our prospects for having a range of planetary health futures, which are broader than they currently are. At the myth metaphor level, the dominant one under the issue which I raised in the previous one around worldview with economics as the dominant force is this whole myth or metaphor really that growth is good. And in fact, you know, more growth is good. And you will hear this consistently in terms of the possible futures in terms of recovery and how different countries and nation states will get through COVID-19 with the good grace of having rapid economic growth and recovery. However, for me, a more useful metaphor is this one: clean up your mess, love Mother. Of course, this is a message from Mother Earth. And from a planetary health perspective, she's basically saying to us that the Anthropocene, with all its ills, is something that needs to be addressed to get into a position where, in fact, we can have different planetary health futures rather than the prospect of what's staring us in the face at the moment. And in fact, it's not just change now, it's the metaphor is change course now. We need to move in a different direction if we're to address these planetary health challenges and to give us a broader range of options. We are, in fact, in a bottleneck right now. We've been in the bottleneck probably for 20 years. E.O. Wilson wrote about the bottleneck in about 2002, and we are still struggling through this bottleneck, and it'll be interesting to see what emerges from this bottleneck at the end of this period of distress. And it may go on for quite some time, especially if we don't change course now. The metaphor about making peace with nature from that report is a useful one. It creates space for us to work differently with the natural system. I find making peace with nature, though, a little bit passive. I would prefer the metaphor about cleaning up the mess. Although I must say that the report about making peace with nature does address many of the issues around cleaning up the mess we've created. This, though, is the metaphor that underpins in many ways the change that's required. We need to love Mother Earth sincerely rather than just talking about it. I think that the range of options that we currently have, and Richard Slaughter's written about this in Futures last year about farewell to alternative futures, is as a result of the fact that our love for Mother Earth faded in favour of some other wants and needs, including increased consumption and consumerism and a belief about what makes a better world, and we're now paying the price for that. So at a personal level, though, this is a Gaian sort of perspective, and this is an image from Sahel Iniotula, and it's about, in a Gaian world, the globe is a living organism and we're part of it. We are clearly within it. We're not separate. It's not functioning. So all the ecosystem services issues which I've raised around planetary health are part of this picture very clearly, and we serve in a way which actually is co-evolutionary and complementary. So that's at a personal level. What can we do about that? How do we engage differently to ensure that we have planetary health futures which we actually want, rather than the most probable ones which are facing us now? And what's happened most recently for a number of areas is this increasing interest and respect and understanding, I think, for the fact that Indigenous and First Nations ways of knowing have been are so valuable. And in fact, if we had been living in a way and relating to the land and the planet in the way that many First Nations and Indigenous people were, and some still are, we would be in a far better place in terms of planetary health right now. And I think it's interesting that the interest around this has grown quite rapidly over recent years, at least from my perspective. However, at the bigger level, yeah.
Peter, we need to wrap up a little bit. Okay, we have like a couple of minutes.
This is the last. This is it. Right now.
Perfect.
Second last slide. Second last slide. So this is around the fact that it's the way we relate to the planet. You know, the planet has suffered from meteors and lots of things in the past, but we haven't paid attention to the impacts that we've had. We've been so enchanted with our so-called progress that we haven't looked at how much the planet can actually take. So the major changes required to improve planetary health, they are big, and they require big ideas. Although there's chaos, it's not all uncertain. In fact, the direction for the future is pretty clear in some direction. And for us to change that path and chart a different course does rely on interior strength and hope, and probably quite different governance processes, which may be discussed in other areas. But I'd love to see something like a Planetary Health Commission, where decisions made at all levels, there's some ruler run over it to see whether it actually improves our options around planetary health, gives us more options for the future, or if it starts to collapse those options, I don't think we should be living with them. So I'll hand it back to you, Miguel. That's it. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Peter. That is a beautiful CLA. And when we work with different customers and people get introduced to Foresight and they try to understand the causes and do an analysis on why things happen, one of the most difficult tools always for them is the CLA. So you did a great masterclass on how we should be analyzing the issues that we have today with health using the CLA as a tool, and how we should be changing. If we finally want to change anything, the action should be on the myth, on the metaphor, because that is what is going to be changing everything up the level. Most people stay in the litany.
Correct. I agree with you totally. It's a little bit adapted because I think the system causes level, you could handle it in a different way, but for this presentation, I was happy just to tie up the issues together so people appreciate how they're being combined.
No, it's been incredible, an incredible masterclass on how to do a CLA. So it's super, super, super exciting to see it used. So thank you so much, Peter. We are going to close up. We are a little bit late for the next session.
Yeah,
so,
sorry.
No, don't. Okay. We had a little bit of technical issues at the beginning, so that's it's okay. It happens. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. We will be sharing the presentation when we complete the summit, and it will be online. So everyone will be also able to access and rewatch the presentation. And everyone else, we are back in about 3 to 5 minutes with Alex Fernani from Singapore. And we are going to be talking about the lack of theory, or the eagerness to find theories on the futures and foresight practice. So see you now, and thank you again, Peter.
Thank you. Bye.